The lights in the Good Morning America studio flared to life as cameras zoomed in on George Stephanopoulos seated behind the polished desk. Script in hand, his expression unreadable. Meghan Markle had been invited for a feature segment meant to highlight her upcoming foundation launch and philanthropic work, but whispers in media circles had already hinted that George planned to press her on more than charitable causes. The air in the studio felt electric, with producers exchanging nervous glances as Meghan walked in, composed but visibly alert, dressed in sleek black with minimal makeup and her signature calm poise. As she greeted George, the usual warmth between host and guest felt strained and rehearsed. The segment began routinely. George asked about the mission behind her new initiative, and Meghan answered smoothly, with practiced ease, emphasizing mental health support, education, equity, and dismantling media toxicity. But within minutes, George shifted gears, asking sharply about her strained relationship with the British royal family and her media strategy decisions. Meghan tensed briefly, her smile tightening as she clarified that she wanted to move forward, not backward. George pressed again, this time questioning whether her public narrative contradicted the reality of her privileges and choices, sparking the first ripple of visible tension on set. Meghan responded with composure, saying that speaking truth didn't negate privilege and that her experiences within institutional structures still held value and pain regardless of status. George leaned forward now, tone sharpening, as he suggested that many critics viewed her as manipulative, more invested in controlling public perception than transparency. Meghan's eyes narrowed slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She responded that criticism was part of visibility, but that some critiques were rooted in misogyny and racial bias. George didn't back down, instead referencing unnamed former Palisades, who had accused her of bullying and calculated behavior. Meghan's voice grew firmer as she stated that smearing women who speak up was a global pattern, not a royal anomaly. The energy in the room began to shift, the air thick with anticipation, as the normally composed George adopted a more prosecutorial tone, launching into a list of media contradictions, inconsistencies between past interviews, press releases, and alleged leaks. Meghan interrupted finally, her voice edged with controlled frustration, saying, "George, I came here to talk about solutions, not refight old battles. You wouldn't treat every guest like this." The audience watching at home and in studio caught the fire behind her words. The shift from diplomacy to defiance. George responded coolly that journalism wasn't hospitality and tough questions weren't personal. Meghan paused for a moment, visibly swallowing irritation before speaking again, measuring each word carefully, then asked tough questions. "George, not tired ones we've already outgrown," she said, referencing years of media fixation on narratives that had long been litigated both in public forums and in the court of opinion. George smirked briefly, a gesture that lit up social media. Within seconds, as viewers began recording and posting clips to TikTok and X, Meghan continued speaking, firmly but without theatrics, outlining how public perception was a moving target shaped by headlines rather than facts. She pointed out that scrutiny didn't make someone untruthful, just unpopular to certain power structures. George cut in, asking why transparency seemed selective with her team, releasing curated statements but avoiding unfiltered interviews. Meghan laughed softly, but with no mirth, before responding that transparency doesn't mean surrendering yourself to hostile framing. The debate had clearly evolved from interview to confrontation, and the studio felt like a political debate. Stage now, not a morning news segment. Meghan glanced once at the teleprompter, then back at George, locking eyes as she said, "Sometimes the loudest critics are simply uncomfortable with a woman writing her own story." That line drew a subtle reaction from producers. Scene shifting. In their seats while the crew whispered behind cameras, George wasn't rattled, though he leaned in again, challenging Meghan about inconsistencies in her Netflix documentary compared to earlier interviews. She replied sharply that edited storytelling didn't erase authenticity and that changing perspective didn't mean lying but evolving. The conversation escalated as George pointed out that public figures should expect complete accountability, not curated sympathy. Meghan replied that accountability also required context, not just spectacle, The studio grew increasingly quiet as the exchange became more intense than any recent. GMA segment George's next question was a pointed inquiry about her alleged request to influence editorial coverage. During her time as a working royal, Meghan's face hardened as she pushed back forcefully, saying that voicing concern over racism and bias wasn't manipulation, but survival strategy. The tension between them reached a visible peak as both leaned forward, speaking over one another briefly before the producers signaled to cut to commercial. Meghan removed her mic earpiece, briefly turning away. While George shuffled his cards without looking up, it was clear to everyone this wasn't just an interview anymore, it was ideological combat playing out live. When they returned from break, George tried to lighten the tone by asking about Meghan's motherhood journey and personal evolution post-royalty, but the shift felt disingenuous. Meghan answered coolly, speaking about resilience and her children's right to a world free from weaponized narratives. George nodded but circled back again, asking if she felt her public rebranding erased some hard truths. Meghan, now visibly frustrated, responded that her so-called rebranding was simply survival in a system built to consume and discard women once they stepped out of line. She said truth wasn't a fixed currency and that people grow, reshape, and recover. She said, "I'm not here to explain a past that's already been twisted to entertain. I'm here to build what comes after." George responded that some believed her refusal to answer uncomfortable questions reinforced suspicions of calculated branding. She leaned forward, now voice unwavering, and said, "What you call calculated, I call conscious. I've had to be deliberate just to stay sane." The audience in studio clapped instinctively, which surprised even the producers who had warned against audience reactions on sensitive topics. The energy was now fully on her side, as the balance of control subtly tipped in Meghan's favor. George Stephanopoulos leaned back silently for a second, as Meghan delivered a final point that landed like a closing argument. She said, "If women of color aren't allowed to change the story, then we're not being asked for honesty. We're being set up to fail." The room held still as the weight of her words settled. George finally broke the silence with a flat "Thank you, Meghan, for being here." Meghan smiled tightly, not smugly, more like someone who knew she had crossed fire and made it through without burning down. The interview ended not with handshakes or laughter, but with two professionals exhausted from verbal sparring. Meghan stood before the cameras cut and simply said, "I hope we eventually care more about people than narratives." George remained seated, rearranging his cards, his jaw clenched just slightly off air. The tension lingered, with studio staff unsure how to debrief what they'd just witnessed within 20 minutes. The internet had exploded with opinions, praise, criticism, and endless recaps as the raw clip circulated millions of times. GMA's social team initially tried to edit the exchange down to neutral highlights, but the full live feed had already gone viral, unfiltered and unpredictable. Within hours, every news site had front page breakdowns of the argument. Columnists weighed in on whether George had gone too far or whether Meghan had finally met an interviewer who wouldn't defer to royalty. Internet personalities picked apart tone, body language, and the subtle power dynamics of the exchange. Late-night hosts joked about Meghan surviving the GMA grill, but most praised her poise while calling George unusually aggressive for a morning segment. The backlash toward George from some viewers was swift, accusing him of veering from hard questions into personal attacks. Meanwhile, others defended him, saying journalism wasn't public relations and that public figures had to be pushed. Meghan released no official statement, but her foundation posted a calm message about the importance of discourse and the danger of dehumanization. In media, George's team also remained silent, but behind the scenes, ABC executives were reportedly split over whether the tone of the segment helped or hurt the show's credibility. The clash had gone beyond news. It was now cultural commentary about race, gender, power, and narrative control on live television. Meanwhile, George returned to GMA the following Monday, acting as if nothing had happened, professionally unshaken but personally more measured. His questions to guests were noticeably softer, and he avoided loaded phrasing. Producers reportedly adjusted pre-interview protocols following the segment, ensuring that guests would be briefed on tone and content more transparently. Meghan's camp declined all further daytime news interviews for the next several months instead. Choosing long-form formats and academic conversations over soundbite press circuits, the ripple from that morning lived on, reshaping how media figures approached high-profile interviews.